This is the World Cup logo animation, and I just recreated it as a beginner in Cavalry. Now, how did I do this? Well, to start, I added a rectangle and added a few adjustments. And later on, I'll also show you the full animation process so you can create this one for yourself. Once the rectangle was added, I added it to a duplicator and set the distribution to point and duplicated it 10 times. Now, this is what makes this ripple effect you see in the animation. And I made sure to rotate the shape and connect the shape scale. And now we could right click and add a behavior called value. And what this does is, well, it provides a value. And this is sort of the control center for our whole animation. And this value right here, I originally set to 1.1, but I later found out you can just set it to 1 and it won't really make a difference. The most important thing is the offset right here. As you can see, it changes the visual look quite a lot, but it changes all the duplicates. So I added a stagger behavior to this, and now hovering over the duplicator, you can see that every one of these shapes, these duplicates, is staggered, and that's exactly what we want for this effect. So I changed the maximum value to -12, and now you can see changing this strength here, you can see it sort of goes out, sort of like in the original animation. So we could animate this by setting the frame to 60, then adding a keyframe and setting the frame to 0 and adding the strength of a 0. And now you can see that by quickly changing the magic easing here to very slow out, you'll see that we have something that sort of looks like the original, but of course still needs a lot of work. One of them being color. So I decided to add a color array and then adding 10 colors to this color array, and then we could connect this color array by dragging the blue dot onto the rectangle shape's fill color. Now, I have already saved these colors into a palette right here, but you can just copy the hex codes if you would like. And now that we're done with the color palette, we can see we have something more close to the original, but there's still a long way to go. And one of these things I see that's a problem is that everything is moving at the same exact time. And I thought, why not add an offset? A staggered time offset will make it look quite cool. So inside of this new stagger here, we can set the maximum value to maybe 10. And since it staggers all the movement, we can also set an offset of -10. And now you'll see that they sort of move a little more independently and sort of staggered, almost that some of them are a little delayed. But I wanted this stagger to be reversed, so I set the strength to -100. And now you can see sort of a bit of a change, but it might be a little difficult to see right here. So what you can do is you can, of course, set the, for example, the maximum value to something higher just to demonstrate. And you can see how everything doesn't move at the exact same time. So I set that back to 10, and we now had the base of the animation done. But I thought that it could be cool if we go ahead and add some drop shadow to this rectangle shape. So I did that, and it was a little strong, even though it helped to sort of differentiate each one of these. I set the alpha of the color of the drop shadow to something lower, like 30. And apart from having this sort of springing out effect like we have here, the original also had this like pulsing, almost infinite loop effect that I sort of wanted to mimic in my animations. And I did that by going into the value and noticing changing the strength, we could sort of manipulate how these rings were moving. So by adding a keyframe at frame 60 and then moving the playhead to frame 70 and then changing the strength to something a bit larger like 160 to sort of have this sort of animation principle of like anticipation, we could then later on at frame 100 move it back to something lower, like maybe -250%. And now you'll see we sort of course we don't have any interesting easing right now, but it gave us this nice effect that also worked with this stagger, and we could now add some easing by selecting all keyframes and then changing it to Bezier. And then after some adjustments, we can see that we have something looking quite nice. And of course, there's still some issues, but we're gonna fix that later. For now, I was happy with how it looked, and we could go ahead and loop the animation by selecting all keyframes and selecting the second option, which sort of preserved the new starting position so that it went more and more out, like you could see here. And this would make it so that we could actually loop it by making the background completely black in the end. So I had to make sure that the corners weren't visible after the second repetition here, and that was just done by changing the end strength here to something like -275, and then seeing that the corners here were disappearing around frame 160, and then I set that as the end keyframe. Now, of course, the looping wouldn't really work right now because we can see the backdrop is still white. So I went ahead and changed that to black. And now you can see that we almost have a seamless loop. There's still some issues with the center rectangle here, but we're gonna fix that in a second. But for now, the movement was done and we can now implement a logo. For this, I used my own logo, which matches this animation perfectly. What a coincidence. But yeah, once that was done, we could add some movement by adding yet another rectangle and matching the settings from the original rectangle we duplicated, but rotating it immediately, and then setting the color to white. And for this, I wanted to sort of act almost as a button. So I set the logo on the top, and now we could add some keyframes. First of all, connecting the X scale to the Y scale and then setting it to 1.4 at frame 0. Then adding a keyframe at that, then moving the playhead 10 frames ahead and setting the scale to 1.15, and then moving another 5 keyframes and changing the scale back to 1.4, so it sort of acts as a button click. Then at the end, I wanted to add some easing by selecting all keyframes and then hitting Shift 1, and that's going to add sort of a very subtle easing, but you can also add a more extreme ease in, ease out by selecting Shift 2. Now, at this point, you might think, well, aren't we done now? But there's actually one major issue. But first of all, just make sure to connect the drop shadow onto the rectangle shape here, the new one, so we have some drop shadow on all rectangles. But now for the big problem, and that is that when you play the animation, you will notice that on the first pulse here, you can see that there appears sort of this black square when it's actually supposed to only appear at the end. You can see it is here at the end, which is nice, but you can see that it sort of scales outwards here and sort of peeks through, which isn't supposed to happen. Now, this might have something to do with the stagger we're using and going negative on the strength, but a way I found to fix this was to go in and add a visibility sequence, then connect that visibility sequence into the duplicator's shape visibility. Now, at this, we can then determine which of these duplicates are being shown, but we can also select which ones are always on. So the trick I did was I selected all the rectangles except the last black one here as on, and now you can see that we can go ahead and go to a place where it's on here, and you can see we can actually disable that one rectangle. And what I thought I could do was to go ahead and skip past that point where that glitch is, and then only then enable the visibility of that one. So I went over to frame 95 and then set the visibility to 0 on the end here, then move one frame ahead and set the frame or the end here to 100%. And now we could see we've sort of fixed the problem, which I know it's a workaround, but it works. Now, if you enjoyed watching this video, make sure to subscribe and like, and completely optional, but you're welcome to buy me a coffee through the link below. Thanks for watching.